Rain fell like silver needles against the tall glass windows of Ashford Manor. The house itself looked less like a home and more like a monument. Towering pillars, polished marble floors, grand staircases that spiraled like endless ribbons. Yet despite its grandeur, there was an unmistakable emptiness, an echo that followed every step down its long corridors. Alexander Ashford, the man whose name was carved into the very stones of the estate, stood at the head of the dining table. His eyes, as cold as the rain outside, lingered on the empty seat opposite him. Dinner for two had been laid out, but for years that chair had remained untouched. He was 40, handsome in a chiseled, unapproachable way, with hair the color of dark steel and shoulders that seemed to carry not just his wealth but his loneliness. For all the millions he owned, there was one thing missing, an heir. Someone to inherit not just his fortune, but his name, his legacy, his empire. And Alexander Ashford was not a man who tolerated the word impossible. The maid, Emma Carter, pressed her palms against the sink, rinsing the last of the crystal wine glasses. She had been working in the mansion for just under a year, a maid among the many silent shadows that drifted through the halls. Unlike the other staff, Emma never complained. She never looked at Alexander as a cold-hearted tyrant the way others whispered behind his back. Instead, she saw the loneliness that leaked through the cracks of his pride. She was young, 24, with hair like autumn's fire and eyes the color of the forest at dusk. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her, yet her quiet dignity made her stand out in a house filled with pretension. One evening, as she dusted the shelves of the grand library, Alexander entered. He rarely acknowledged the servants, yet this time, his gaze lingered. She bowed her head quickly, ready to excuse herself. "Stay," his deep voice commanded. Emma froze, cloth in hand, heart racing. Alexander stepped closer. His presence was overwhelming, his cologne mingling with the scent of old books and rain seeping through the windows. "I've been watching you," he said, his tone calm but deliberate. "You're loyal, silent, honest." Emma swallowed hard, unsure where this conversation was going. Then came the words that would change everything. "I want an heir, Maid." The proposal. Emma's breath caught. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. "Sir," she whispered. Alexander's eyes locked on hers. "You heard me. I want an heir. I have no time for empty courtships, no patience for shallow women after my fortune. I require a mother for my child. Nothing more, nothing less." Emma's heart pounded. "But why me?" "Because you are not like the others," he said simply. "You do not scheme. You do not pretend. You work quietly, without complaint. And above all, you seem trustworthy." Emma shook her head, her voice trembling. "You're asking me to bear your child?" Alexander nodded once, as though discussing a business contract. "I will provide everything," he continued. "Wealth beyond your imagination, security for the rest of your life. But in return, I expect loyalty. You will give me an heir." The silence stretched. Emma could hear the rain pounding harder outside. Her mind spun. She was just a maid. She had come from nothing. How could she possibly agree to something so enormous? And yet, something in his voice wasn't just command. There was a plea buried beneath the steel. A man desperate, not just for an heir, but for connection. Emma whispered, I need time to think." Alexander's lips curved in the faintest smile. "You have until tomorrow." The decision. That night, Emma lay awake in the small servant quarters beneath the grand staircase. She thought of her past. The years of struggle, the endless jobs, the loneliness of having no family of her own. Here was a chance, however unusual, to change everything. But was she ready to give her body, her future, her heart, to a man who saw this as nothing more than a transaction? Yet, when she remembered the hollow look in Alexander's eyes at the dining table, something softened in her. He wasn't as cold as he seemed. His wealth had built him walls so high that no one dared to climb them. And perhaps she, a simple maid, was the only one who could. By dawn, Emma had made her choice. The agreement. The next morning, Emma entered the library where Alexander awaited her. His gaze was steady, almost unreadable. "Well?" he asked. Emma drew in a breath. "I'll do it. I'll give you an heir." For the first time, Alexander's eyes flickered with something other than detachment, relief. "Good," he said, though his voice softened. "Then from this day forward, You are no longer just a maid. The household staff buzzed with rumors when Emma was moved from the servants' quarters to a room near Alexander's own. Whispers followed her through the corridors, envious glares burned into her back. But Emma kept her head high. And slowly, against all odds, something unexpected began to bloom. The blossoming. At first, their interactions were formal, almost clinical. Alexander was a man of precision. Schedules, medical consultations, arrangements for the future heir. Yet despite his rigidity, Emma found glimpses of a gentler man beneath the armor. One evening, as she sat in the garden with a book, Alexander joined her without invitation. He didn't speak at first, only watched the roses swaying in the breeze. "My mother loved roses," he said finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard. "She used to say they were proof that beauty and pain are always intertwined." Emma looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. In moments like this, she realized Alexander Ashford was not the ruthless millionaire the world saw. He was a man scarred by loss, longing for something real. And Emma, unknowingly, was becoming that something. The transformation. Weeks turned into months. Emma's presence softened the mansion's coldness. She filled the halls with warmth simply by existing. Her laughter in the kitchen, her gentle humming as she arranged flowers, the kindness she showed even to the lowest servant. And Alexander changed. He no longer dined alone. He waited for Emma to join him. He began to ask her opinion on matters outside their arrangement. He even smiled more often, something the staff had once whispered was impossible. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, Alexander reached for her hand. It was not part of the agreement. It was not calculated. It was simply human. Emma's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. For the first time, the walls around Alexander Ashford began to crumble. Love, unspoken. By the time Emma discovered she was with child, the mansion had already transformed into something brighter. When she told Alexander, he stood in silence, his hands clenched at his sides. Then, to her astonishment, he fell to his knees before her, resting his forehead gently against her stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. It was then Emma realized. What had begun as a contract had turned into something deeper. Something neither of them dared to name yet. Love. The trials. But love, like roses, came with thorns. News of Emma's pregnancy reached the city, and soon whispers turned into scandals. Society ladies sneered that Alexander had chosen a maid to bear his heir. Business rivals mocked him. Newspapers printed cruel headlines. Millionaire's legacy stained by servant blood. Alexander grew protective, shielding Emma from the cruel outside world. Yet Emma reminded him gently, "They can't define us. Only we can." And so they endured. Together. The heir. 9 months later, the mansion that once echoed with silence rang with the cries of new life. Emma gave birth to a baby boy. Small, perfect, with Alexander's storm-gray eyes. When Alexander held his son for the first time, his stoic mask shattered. Tears slid down his cheeks, unashamed. "My heir," he whispered. Then, looking at Emma, he added, "Our heir." In that moment, everything changed. No longer was Emma just the maid. No longer was Alexander just the untouchable millionaire. They were a family. The confession. One evening, months later, Alexander found Emma in the nursery, rocking their son to sleep. He watched silently, his heart swelling with emotions he had denied for so long. Finally, he spoke. "Emma," he said softly. She looked up, smiling tiredly. "Yes." Alexander stepped closer, his voice unsteady. "I once asked you for an heir, but what you gave me was so much more. You gave me life. You gave me love. You gave me yourself." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I love you," he whispered, the words raw and real. Emma's breath caught, and then she smiled through her tears. "I love you too." The legacy. Years passed, and Ashford Manor was no longer a house of silence. It was filled with laughter, footsteps, and warmth. Alexander, once a man bound by pride and loneliness, had become a husband, a father, and a man reborn. And Emma, the maid who had walked into the mansion with nothing, now stood as its lady, cherished not for her status, but for her heart. The world could whisper all it wanted. Alexander no longer cared, for he had everything he had ever desired: an heir, a family, and above all, love. Epilogue. On the balcony of Ashford Manor, Alexander stood with Emma and their son. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Alexander wrapped an arm around Emma, pulling her close. "I once thought I only needed an heir," he murmured. "But what I needed was you." Emma smiled, leaning into him. "And you found me." Together, they watched the future unfold before them, not as master and maid, not as millionaire and servant, but as soulmates who had defied the odds. And in that moment, the mansion that had once been built of stone and shadows became something greater. A home.